Thanks everybody for coming out for this. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. Today, we're really fortunate to have a roundtable / book talk on this new volume by Scott Mainwaring and Tarek Masoud, Democracy in Hard Places. As you will see, it really speaks to some vital questions of our time, speaks to a really wide range of cases and places where we might think that democracy would be unlikely to take root, but that it has. And so I think this book does an amazing job of drawing lessons from that. And so we have both of the co-editors here, as well as Rachel Riedl, who's one of the chapter authors. Wrote a chapter on Beatty in South Africa. There's Rachel, looking small on the, this is a very surreal experience. And so let me just really briefly introduce our three panelists and then kind of get through. We have a lot of material to go through. So Scott Mainwaring is the Eugene and Helen Conley Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. His research and teaching focus on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties and party systems, and Latin American politics. His work with Anibal Perez Lignan, Democracies and Dictatorships in Latin America, Emergence, Survival, and Fall, won the Best Book Prizes of the Comparative Politics section of APSA and the Political Institutions section of the Latin American Studies Association. Scott was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2010. Tarek Masoud is the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Governance at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and he serves as the faculty director of the Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative and the Initiative on Democracy in Hard Places. His research focuses on political development in Arabic-speaking and Muslim-majority countries. He's the author of Counting Islam, Religion, Class, and Elections in Egypt, as well as the Arab Spring, Pathways for Oppression and Reform. Rachel Beatty Riedl, who is with us virtually from Cornell. Rachel is the director of the Einaudi Center for International Studies and the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies and Professor of Government at Cornell University. Her research interests include institutional development and new democracies, local governance and decentralization policy, authoritarian regime legacies, and religion and politics, with a regional focus in sub-Saharan Africa. Rachel is the co-host of the podcast Ufahamu Africa, featuring weekly episodes of news highlights and interviews about life and politics on the African continent. So we've got three really tremendous speakers. They've really written some amazing work, and I'm eager to turn it over to them to hear more about it. So Scott and Tarek, as you will. All right.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else is like me. Whenever I'm on a Zoom call, I'm always just looking at myself. Is everybody else like that? So now I want to look at myself. So first of all, I want to thank Professor Slater for inviting us. I want to thank Derek Groom for organizing and making sure that we got here in one piece. I've been tasked by my fearless leader, Scott, with just providing a broad introduction to the book. And as is my wont, I might be a little bit solipsistic in offering that introduction. So we are living now at a time in which democracy is constantly said to be under grave threat. And in fact, even in highly industrialized, advanced societies like our own, there's this very deep sense of foreboding that the forces of illiberalism and authoritarianism are upon us. So it might seem a little bit weird that we would come out with a book that's not about how democracy dies, but rather about how it survives, and particularly about how it survives in places where you wouldn't expect it to survive, in places that face challenges like underdevelopment, economic crisis, ethnic fragmentation, and endemic state weakness. And in this book's introduction, we say, well, if you pay attention to democratic survival in these inhospitable places, that can help inform us about how to keep democracy alive in places like the United States or the advanced industrialized democracies that we live in. Because after all, if you can figure out how they got and kept democracy in a place like Timor-Leste, then figuring out how to do it in a place like the United States should be relatively easy by comparison. So that's one of the things we say in the book about the rationale behind the project, but it's kind of dishonest. That's not how the project came about. We were not thinking that when the project came about. The way I would describe this book is that it's actually an attempt to settle a debate. And it's a long-standing debate in the political science literature, but it's also a debate between the co-editors of this volume. And I'm going to give you a spoiler. I'm going to say at the outset, it's a debate that I lost as a result of this book. So everybody here is familiar with the broad. So any work of political science has to begin with the 2x2 table. Okay. So when those of you who are doctoral students, start with the 2x2 table, then think, what can I put on the axes? And pretty soon you'll have 10. Okay, so everybody's familiar with the broad categorization of the literature on democracy along two axes. One axis emphasizes the structure versus agency. Some scholars of democracy say that democracy is basically the deterministic outcome of antecedent structural conditions, whereas others say that no, in fact, actors acting in time, making decisions can affect the course of a country's political development. And so political development is really a contingent outcome. So that's one dimension in the literature, people who focus on structure, people who focus on agency. Another dimension in the literature are people who focus, that sort of think of as one of the proximate causes of democracy is values. You know, there are democratic values, whether those democratic values be among the elite or among the masses, and others who look at democracy as really a function of the interplay of interest between the key political actors. And it's possible to have structural accounts that emphasize interest, structural accounts that emphasize values, et cetera. And so here's my kind of quick and dirty way to categorize the literature. So the structural accounts of democratization that emphasize interest would be those accounts that say that democracy emerges when you achieve a certain degree of social complexity, such that no political actor or no political social force is able to rule on its own or rule by command. And so everybody has to agree to democracy as a kind of second best option, but that emerges from these prior structural conditions. It's kind of one strand of the modernization approach. Another strand of the modernization approach starts again with modernization, with economic development, but says that the relevant change it produces is in the values of the masses. The people, begin to, they want to politically self-actualize and participate. They also embrace norms of compromise, et cetera. So modernization leads to the embrace of certain values. Okay, so that's structural accounts with interest values, and then but there are also agent-centric accounts that are also, some are focused on the interests of the agents, and others focus on the values of agents. And here they're really talking about political values. And so when I began my scholarly career, I was definitely in this upper right-hand quadrant. Okay, I believed that politics was a function of material conditions. I didn't think that values or culture mattered at all. I really thought that you could explain the emergence of democracy with reference to interests and to antecedent conditions. And I would look at cases like the ones in this book, the case of India, the case of Indonesia, the case of Timor-Leste, as basically like exceptions to the rule, illustrations of the fact that, there is such a thing as human unpredictability. But I would have told you that all of those places will eventually regress to the authoritarian mean. They're off the regression line, but they'll get back there. Then the Arab Spring happened. So I'm a scholar of the Middle East, and when millions of people in these places that we thought were durable authoritarian regimes took to the streets to throw off the yoke of dictatorship, I experienced a tension between my intellectual orientation, which told me, like, look, you just look at the conditions here, none of these is going to succeed, and frankly, my emotional reaction to those events, which told me that people here are really making their own politics. And maybe I categorize that as an emotional reaction, but it was also a fact that I, as a scholar, am observing something happening in the world that does open up a sense of possibility. So, I didn't think that I could, I thought I was observing something really important. And I also didn't think I would be a very helpful scholar if I show up in Egypt and say to everybody, well, this is not going to succeed. Look at your per capita GDP and your illiteracy rate. I mean, sorry, as a scholar, you just can't do that. So at that time, this is around 2011, I really set out trying to learn as much as I could from cases of improbable democratic transition, these places that I had earlier dismissed as just contributing to the residual. And it's at this time at the Kennedy School, we started the project on democracy in hard places, from which this book takes its name. And I started going a lot to Indonesia because we had some connections to Indonesia, and that was the quintessential hard place. And that's when I started reading Dan Slater's work. And the inquiry, I thought, like, I'm going to go to Indonesia, I'm going to learn what they did there, so bring it back to people in Egypt. And all of that, of course, was cut short by a military coup that undid the democratic experiment in Egypt. And if I had begun to become a little bit more open to the role of agency in getting and keeping democracy, the failure of the Arab Spring, which is exactly what a hardened structuralist would have predicted, snapped me out of it. And I ended up actually writing something that reaffirmed my earlier structural position, and which explained the Arab Spring's sole success story, Tunisia, with reference to its more favorable structural conditions. So we talked about world historical events, the Arab Spring. The second world historical event that really shaped my thinking was the arrival of Scott Mainwaring to Harvard University. And I don't exaggerate when I say that Scott's arrival in 2016 was one of the most intellectually consequential things that happened to me. So anybody who knows Professor Mainwaring and knows me knows that, despite our very close resemblance, our, very similar speaking style, that one of the few differences between is that he has an encyclopedic knowledge of democratic transition and breakdown around the world. And I concluded very quickly that I needed to spend as much time learning from him as possible. And so we became co-directors of a revitalized democracy in hard places program. And we started teaching a course together called Getting and Keeping Democracy. We taught that course twice before Scott returned to Notre Dame. And that was basically a semester-long inquiry into how you get and keep democracy. More importantly, it was a debate between us about the causes of democratic emergence and survival. And Scott's perspective was very different from mine. So I was a hardened structuralist. Scott was fresh off of completing his magisterial work with Anabel Perez-Lignan on democracy and dictatorship in Latin America, argued quite possibly that powerfully that we could not explain democratic survival in inhospitable terrain without attending to the normative commitments of the key collective political actors. Argued that democracy is sustained by actors who bear a preference for democracy and are willing at key moments to elevate that preference above their other policy desiderata. And I kept coming to him with this Adam Przeworski belief that, quote, the goal of all politicians is to remain in office forever and to use their tenure to do whatever they want, and they only behave democratically when they're constrained to do so. And Scott just had a lot of examples where that clearly wasn't the case. And so the idea to do this book came out kind of as a way of settling the debate. We'd assemble some of the sharpest scholars of comparative democratization that we know, and we'd ask them two ideas. So this is the, how do I do this? So, is it not right? So this is the book, and then look at that CGI. Okay, so this is the slide where I point to the sharp scholars. Who would, and we just asked them, we picked scholars from almost every region of the world that experienced the third wave of democracy, and we asked them to pick unlikely democracies in their part of the world and to try to offer an account of why those democracies managed to survive. We didn't ask them to make a particular argument. I was secretly hoping that all of the accounts would validate my perspective. And the book's 9 cases are Argentina from 1983 to the present, Benin, from 1991 to 2019, Georgia from 2005 to present, India, which is kind of quintessential democracy in a hard place, Indonesia, which Professor Slater wrote about, Moldova for 2 periods, 1995 to 05, and then 2010 to the present, South Africa since 1995, Timor-Leste since 2002, and Ukraine from 95 to 98, and then from 2007 to 2014. I think Ukraine is also having another democratic resurgence. So if you look at these cases, this is not a very appealing table, and I apologize for showing this to you, but they are hard cases on many different dimensions. So many of them are quite poor, very low GDP per capita. Argentina is an outlier here that has a relatively high GDP per capita compared to the other cases. But of course, it is a hard case in that it suffered crushing economic crisis of the kind that routinely causes democracies to collapse. Ethnic fractionalization is a serious problem in many of these countries. So there's a state capacity as a problem in other of these countries. So many of these countries are hard on multiple dimensions, but every one of them is hard on at least one dimension. Now, Rachel's going to discuss her amazing chapter on Benin in South Africa, and then Scott will distill the lessons of the book for us. But the result of this project, I want to say, really is that Scott, at least for me, won the debate. And as I think you'll see from the discussion that follows, many of the cases of this book validate the perspective that normative commitments to democracy can act as what we call in this book internal constraints on actors, preventing them from engaging in democracy undermining behaviors, even when a narrow reading of their interests would suggest that these behaviors would benefit them. We find leaders who obey constitutional limits on their power instead of using that power to break their shackles. We see losing opposition parties decide to stick with the democratic game instead of subverting institutions or aligned with grasping militaries. And we see militaries that choose to uphold democracy instead of seeking power for themselves. So this conclusion, right, that elite commitments to democracy matter for its survival, this conclusion raises a number of questions. Right? You could ask, where do these commitments come from? How are they sustained? And what's their relationship to mass normative commitments? Are we really just saying that you need a deep commitment to democracy throughout society? So these are very important questions that are not resolved in this book. But our hope is that this book will shift some of our scholarly focus to actually asking these questions. And I think here, these questions are not of mere academic interest. I don't think anybody could have been paying attention. I started with the question of democratic decline in the advanced democracies. You can't have been paying attention to what's happening in this country and not conclude that leaders' commitments to democracy are often all that is standing between us and the abyss. And I think figuring out how to entrench this commitment to democracy in the people who run our countries and in our citizens has to be one of the major tasks of political science in the 21st century. And I just want to close. This is something that I think, we've known for a very long time. The field needs to now recover it and take it seriously. But this is from Robert Dahl's preface, Democratic Theory. I think, Scott, you studied with Dahl as an undergraduate, is that right? And, Scott and Bob Dahl talks about, he says, the extent to which polyarchy or democracy exists must be related to the extent to which norms are accepted as desirable. So even in this account, norms are very important. And then he goes on to say, how do these norms become broadly accepted? Well, it's processes of social training that are engaged in by the family, by schools, churches, clubs, literature, newspapers alike. And I would argue scholars like us. This is a very important purpose for us as scholars, that this, if in fact democratic norms are part of the magic that keeps democracy alive in hard places and in not so hard places, then we potentially have an important role in inculcating and deepening. And I will now turn it over to my co-authors.
Thank you, Tarek. Your extremely generous comments. While we're waiting, I want to thank Dan for thinking of us, putting this thing together. It was great. And Derek and Tarek, who was an amazing partner in crime. I learned so much working with him. And all of our collaborators. It was just a fantastic group of collaborators. I learned a lot from all of them, even when I had different perspectives than they do on a lot of issues. So, far away. Great, thanks. there are two main perspectives in terms of actors' logic about why democracies could survive. One is it's instrumental, right? Actors are very instrumental. They're instrumental in a narrow way, and democracies can survive because of their constraint. The second one is that they also survive in part because of actors' commitments to democracy. Note that I highlighted here in part because I don't think they survive only because of actors' normative commitments. Many, many authors have adopted both of these perspectives. I've highlighted a few of the very distinguished authors who took the second perspective. So my view is, as Tarek adumbrated, right, completely consistent with the second view. I think that democracy in hard places is in deep trouble if illiberal rulers come to office. And I would also say that democracy in hard places, and even beyond hard places, requires some level of commitment to democracy. This next point is a cautionary one. I don't mean that you need exemplary Democrats in every respect. I don't mean that you need actors who consistently prioritize democracy above narrow self-interests. I mean something akin to what Levitsky and Ziblatt discussed in their 2018 book. You need actors who engage in some level of mutual tolerance and forbearance. So that's not an absurd threshold to think about. So let me suggest 5 claims about actors' preferences about the political regime. Oops, this didn't come out in the right order. But first of all is that actors directly determine regime outcomes. Even all structuralist accounts must somehow connect structures to actors and interests. The second one is that actors and their preferences have a lot of autonomy in relation to structural and other contextual conditions. The third is that actors have very different preferences about the political regime. We could think about Stalin or theocrats on the one side, and that ranges all the way to pretty hardcore commitments to democracy. Fourth is that these preferences are measurable. And then the fifth one is that these preferences have important consequences for regime outcomes. So a central reason why democracy survives in hard places has to do, in my judgment, and I think the empirics in the volume support this, with the fact that governing parties, with most actors, cannot be highly illiberal. Governing parties are particularly important in this respect because they're the prime mover in democratic politics, right? Other actors respond to who is in power. Governing parties have to respect and value liberal democratic norms, at least at that threshold that I suggested, indicated by Levitsky and Ziblatt. And so one of the case that I write about in the book, I also wrote the conclusion, but one of the case that I wrote about in the book was Argentina, which had this past history of repeated failures. Argentina in the 20th century was one of the champions of democratic breakdowns. Every democratic experiment in Argentina broke down, most in short order. So there were 5 breakdowns in the country. This shows, this is the period since 1983. Some of you might know this index, the V-Party Illiberalism Index. It ranges from 0 highly liberal parties to 1 highly illiberal. And the point I'm trying to make with this graph here is precisely that all of the ruling parties in Argentina have scored either extremely low on this illiberalism index. That is, these are parties that are deeply committed to liberal democratic norms, or moderately low. And these are parties that, they're not exemplary Democrats, but on the other hand, they do not engage in deeply illiberal practices. So in the book, I counted 59 elections for the 9 countries, or maybe this was the 6th that really we scored as democracies in hard places. And in all 59 elections in which the ruling party scored low or very low to moderate on this illiberalism index, democracy survived. Conversely, most of the cases where you had a high illiberalism score, democracy either eroded or broke down. So yeah, this is all 9 countries because it includes the 3 post-Soviet republics. The picture here, of course, is conjuring the image of what happens after 2014 when the BJP takes power in India. The party scores it as a quite illiberal party, and the varieties of democracy, liberal democracy score shows, I think correctly, a marked deterioration in the level of democracy. Even if contextual or structural variables remain constant, which they more or less do in within country studies over the short term, if an illiberal party comes to power, in these contexts at least, democracy is very easily imperiled. This is the case of India since 2014, Benin since 2019. This case, of course, is not in our book, but if you think about it, right, I mean, of course, if we go back and look at it retrospectively in the US, there were some important warning signs about democracy before 2016, but no one in their right mind wrote that democracy might break down in the United States before the authoritarian turn in the Republican Party. Now, of course, people debate now whether this is a plausible scenario, but certainly it is something that's on the intellectual agenda of many, many people, and a live worry of close to half of the United States. One of the things the concluding chapter does is, based on what I learned from other authors in the book and also my own understanding of Argentina, I wanted to think some about this question of what generates normative commitments for democracy. So this isn't just a complete black box. And I don't have an answer across all space and time, but at least for 4 of the cases in this book, I think it's useful to think about a profound repudiation of a terrible past generating a commitment to democracy. I also, at least for the Argentine case, focus a lot on this particular part of it, the construction of historical memory, and I'll explain a bit more what I mean. So Argentina, as I mentioned, well, to anticipate a little bit, I'll talk a little bit more about Argentina, but there was the last dictatorship from 1976 to 83 was by every measure an abject failure. And this really created a sea change in actors' attitudes toward democracy. India, here I point to the complete rejection of the colonial past. South Africa, the complete rejection of most South Africans of the apartheid past, and of course the international repudiation, widespread repudiation of the apartheid regime, and Timor-Leste, which was a case about which I knew less than nothing until I learned a lot from the great Nancy Bermeo's chapter in this book. So Timor-Leste, what happened there was a civil war, a bloody civil war followed by an Indonesian invasion. And in Nancy's account, this generated a pretty deep, a radical change in actors' attitudes toward democracy and an embrace of democracy in that country. So the Argentine case, I think no one would dispute that until 1976, most of the important actors were indifferent at best and hostile at worst toward liberal democracy. The failed dictatorship of 1976 to 83, massive repression, defeat in a completely reckless external war against the United Kingdom, and a disastrous economic failure. So by 1982, nobody supported this regime. And it really did lead to a very, very different sensibility about democracy after 1983. You can see this clearly in radical shifts in public opinion about democracy, radical shifts in some of the main parties regarding democracy, Labor unions had been completely indifferent toward liberal democracy, and they completely embraced democracy after 1983, even business associations. So I think there's only one plausible account for what explains this radical change in Argentina. How do you sustain democratic commitments? That too it's got to be part of the social science agenda. I don't think we know very much about this. In Argentina, a lot of this has to do with building very powerful processes of constructing historical memory. This was a volume, it was based on a report that the president elected in 1983 commissioned 5 days after he was in office. It's the famous Nunca Más report that documented thousands and thousands of cases of torture and disappearances. Argentina has around 40 museums of memory, some of which are very famous. And some people, who take tours of Buenos Aires from abroad, some of these tours even take you to at least one of these museums. The most publicized human rights trials in history since Nuremberg after World War II, a National Day of Memory required curriculum in the school system. The data here are a little bit old, but as of 2019, 915 people were imprisoned for human rights abuses. More than 3,000 were charged. Many of these trials were very, very highly publicized. If you were in Argentina at times in the 80s, you would see the lead story on national television was about human rights trials. So 2 presidents were political prisoners. They and the main parties have pushed a human rights agenda. So I think this is partly why we see a sustenance of human rights commitments, democracy commitments in Argentina. So the concluding chapter looks at, I think, potentially complementary, but very insufficient, in my view, explanations for why democracy might be sustained in these places and hard places. One is a balance of power among contending forces. Often, I think you can explain transitions to democracy as an account as a balance of power between outgoing and incoming forces. But look at these 3 graphs, right? First, India, this is the share of seats controlled by the prime minister's party and coalition. And you can see that often, right, in India, the governing party had way more, just completely dominated power. There was no balance of power in India at important times. In another of his great works on Indonesia, Dan Slater had this really evocative term. I think it was promiscuous power sharing. And so almost everyone shared power at certain times in Indonesia. There was no balance of power between the government and the opposition. You can't explain a democratic outcome exclusively or even mainly, I think, on the basis of a balance of power. South Africa, same story, right? The ANC has completely dominated for pretty much the entire democratic period. Second, plausible explanation for keeping actors in check would be formal institutions. My simple view of this is, yes, formal institutions are important, and they are part of any account of why democracy can be sustained. But these are contexts in which formal institutions are generally pretty weak. It's really hard to account for the sustenance of democratic regimes in cases in which leaders can fairly easily tinker with and undermine formal institutions. The final thing I want to mention is a possibility, and I think it really is. Effective governance is important for sustaining democracy, but it's not a necessary condition. Argentina has not had effective governance since 1983, nor have some of the other countries in this volume. Look at some of the data. The data here I've updated the data that Tarek showed, abysmal economic growth on average since 1983, highly regressive income distribution for more than 2 decades, 3 very long and very severe economic crises, and hyperinflation that reached over 1,000% several years and almost 5,000% in the late 90s. So you can't say that Argentina has sustained democracy because of effective governance. Well, let me just offer some conclusions. First, I think, rural democracy in hard places, it's always surprising. One of the essential components, I think, is some level of democratic commitment. Second, if the governing parties are naked power maximizers, I don't think democracy is going to survive in hard places. This is not a stable equilibrium. Third, a partisan balance of power helps, absolutely, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Fourth, institutions can help, but democracies in hard places generally do not have strong institutions. In these democracies in hard places, in the volume when highly illiberal parties came to power, democracy collapsed. I don't think these are atypical cases in that case, in that sense. Thank you all.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Rachel.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And of course, huge thanks to Tarek and Scott for organizing this intellectual agenda. And thanks to Dan and Derek for bringing us together to discuss it. So what I wanted to start with today is really to think about the way in which this project pushes us to think about successes and challenges, and also a little bit to keep the initial debate that Tarek and Scott have laid out alive, because my chapter does take a look at the interests and strategic bargains that were struck, and so in that way is more in the interests category. And so in how we're thinking about it, certainly these are cases, Benin and South Africa, that are more representative about the ways in which democracy is absolutely a very fragile thing, and the possibility of democratic collapse where we least expected it in highly industrialized, advanced, economically developed societies has really added new urgency to these age-old questions into how democracy, once attained, can be made to last, to endure, and to sustain. And I think that we can learn a lot from democratic survivals in the cases that were as unexpected as the democratic erosions that we're currently fearing in some corners of the developed world. So the overarching project here, in terms of thinking about what lessons we can derive from what makes democracy stick, especially during moments of tumult and crisis, allows us to use these 2 cases in Africa to think clearly about how democracy was established and whether or not those transitions and moments of establishing democracy allowed it to be maintained across continuing difficult conditions. So what I want to suggest here is that, as we've laid out, democratic survival in Africa in general, and in Benin and South Africa in particular, is absolutely one of these challenging contexts, right? In that we have, in general, low levels of economic development and industrialization, as you saw from the chart that Scott laid out, that Benin was the case of the very lowest level of development. There are regions of natural resource extraction, there are low levels of state capacity, and certainly there are legacies of colonial predation and challenges of state formation and cohesion that make it difficult to identify the political community for whom democratic values would benefit, which citizenry would benefit from such democratic values and norms. We have multilinguistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious populations, so heterogeneity is very high, and that is also a result of these colonial predation legacies. And so the pool from which democratic erosion and autocratization is most likely is here. This is also a pool from which future democracies could emerge. So how we think about maintaining democratic space or creating new spaces for democratic survival and endurance are highly relevant and important here. I wanted to just build on previous work to think about which set of cases these two regime transitions really represent, and that is those in which authoritarian incumbents conceded defeat, right? So the prior apartheid government in South Africa, the prior Marxist-Leninist single-party dictatorship in Benin, these were parties that were unsustainable and untenable at certain points in time. And so the transitions themselves were highly reform-oriented. They required new constitutions in South Africa and Benin. They required elites to come together to form new compacts, new ways of doing, new democratic commitments, and they required the social inclusion of large sectors of the population to participate in these new democratic experiments. And so these are particularly hard cases, one would argue, because of the way in which institutions are newly formed. They're part of a compact that's coming out of a non-democratic history. And so in the Mainwaring tradition, these are weakly institutionalized party systems and weakly institutionalized democratic systems. And so in that sense, we might think that these are particularly difficult places to sustain democratic regimes and democratic values or interests. The pathways of democratic survival are particularly important for us to think about in terms of how these democratic projects came to be experienced. So in both Benin and South Africa, we have a moment of extreme political, economic, and ideological crises. There was, at the point of transition to democracy, an inability to overcome structural challenges, both economic and on the basis of social identity. So in South Africa, absolutely the end of the apartheid system, the way in which it became to be seen as no longer tenable, both for domestic agents, the increasing violence and mobilization around the end of the apartheid system, in South Africa by the liberation movement, the international pressures to end the system that included sanctions. And so both within the kind of apartheid elite and within the liberation movement, the prior system was no longer able to be maintained. Similarly, in Benin, the country was facing extreme economic collapse. Unions and civic social workers hadn't been paid. And so the prior system that was absolutely constructed on a social and economic model of a kind of Marxist-Leninist single party was rejected. And so in this moment of ideological crisis, incumbent elites, authoritarian elites, conceded to partial inclusion to their renounced role. And they saw that they could no longer control, in a dominant sense, the authoritarian regime that they had controlled over in the decades prior. The insurgent opposition at this point in the transition absolutely had strategic use for including these past authoritarian rulers in some form, in power sharing form, whether it was a kind of, to use Dan Slater's terms, a kind of promiscuous power sharing, right, to bring everyone together in newly constituted political parties that were a bandwagon of bringing everyone in together to be able to rule, or whether it was informal institutional new systems, as in South Africa, with a federal system, with a proportional representation system that would allow the former kind of white socioeconomic elite to have a certain percentage of representation, right? Whether or not they were geographically distributed, or whether or not they would be able to have decentralized control over particular federal areas. And so both in terms of informal party alignment and in terms of formal decentralized structures, agreements were made that would allow for elite interests to be maintained and to be a part of and not completely excluded from this new democratic bargain. And so a major component of this new democratic bargain was that there would be a limited degree of redistribution, right? These were not regimes that were mechanisms for redistribution of prior state-controlled economic resources, and they were not ones that were going to promise that the masses would then see new forms of social and economic mobility. They absolutely enlarged the political and economic elite class to these kind of insurgent elite opposition. And perhaps most importantly, at this moment of crisis, they offered macro security at the level of state functioning. They reduced barriers to accumulation for the elite class, and they provided elections as a mechanisms for limiting discontent, for limiting that social mobilization that Huntington would have said was a measure of changing societies and threats to the standardized ways of controlling of the elite class. So in this moment of transition, democracy is an institutional guarantee of power sharing amongst an elite, an expanded elite consensus. And the reason that I chose both Benin and South Africa is because in many ways they represent shared general challenges of these moments of crisis, and yet they are most different cases in terms of their general structural conditions. They represent difficult conditions for democracy in very different ways. Benin represents a tripartite ethnic divisions, regionally concentrated ethnic divisions, and historically extreme political instability. So in Dahl's 2x2, going back to our favorite 2x2, Benin had full participation in their single party regime, and of course no real competition, right? But it also had weak level of political institutionalization, military coups followed by a single party. And so what it had to offer in terms of democratic legacy was very limited. And similarly, in terms of it being a very different case from South Africa, the economic foundations for democracy were completely lacking. The level of economic crisis placed Benin at the lowest levels of development, and when a country that still relies on cotton as a major economic export is a very agricultural and rural society. In contrast, South Africa represented an extremely difficult case for democracy because of its racialized apartheid, the most cleaved society that one could imagine, one that was institutionally cleaved, and a competitive oligarchy, right, where we had high levels of competition and, of course, extremely limited participation. At the time of transition and into our current day, we have a mid-level of development that was characterized by extreme racial inequality, right? And so the way in which the potential for democracy to redistribute economically represented a grave threat to the ruling party, to the ruling elites. And so this cost of potential redistribution was very high. And so in these ways, South Africa and Benin are most different cases, and yet they've sustained democracy through these kind of institutionalized bargains and power sharing models. How did it happen in South Africa? So in South Africa, we had an inclusive power sharing model for democratic continuity because the incoming opposition ANC recognized the economic necessity of inclusion. And I would say this was absolutely Nelson Mandela at the lead, but supported more broadly. There were debates over this strategy within the ANC. There were debates over whether a more violent redistribution was necessary. And we've seen that route as one that has been taken in Zimbabwe, right, a neighboring country. But the ANC and the Mandela wing of the ANC won this debate about inclusion as the most stable, prosperous route to democratic power sharing that allowed for this kind of negotiated, necessary inclusion of the prior authoritarian parties. And so in this sense, the authoritarian incumbent apartheid National Party retained its stable voter bloc. It retained a stable geographic stronghold from which they had representation, and their interests were not fundamentally threatened by the nature of the transition by the way in which it unfolded, because they were included in the negotiation at every step. And so this institutionalized basis of competition maintained and expanded their ability to see their interests secured into what would otherwise be an incredibly unstable future. And so I think South Africa for us represents a triumph, although it certainly has its challenges. I think that actually Evan Lieberman's new book on South Africa is a great example of this, in the way in which, as this transition was happening, we should never underestimate the extent to which democratic South Africa was never a foregone conclusion. The extent to which forging this democratic compromise was an incredible feat, and it required elites to tie their hands. It required elites to have a kind of moderated version, a non-zero-sum vision of what institutional formation would entail to allow them to craft together a democratic South African future. And I think that is an incredible example for us, as this project alludes to, an incredible example for us to think about how one could bring potential spoilers into the institutionalized bargain and keep them on board for the future. In Benin, we have a similarly kind of ideological, socioeconomic crisis moment. And then the incoming opposition was one which recognized that the necessary inclusion of the outgoing party and military elite, the outgoing rulers of the state, single party and control of the economy, was necessary to overcome the prior decades of ethnic, tripartite, regionally concentrated divisions and instability that had plagued Benin in the years following independence. And so the incoming opposition party saw the inclusion of the former president's old guard, the former president's single party, and military leaders as necessary to be able to constrain the coercive power of the state. So in this way, the authoritarian single party that was kicked out was required to transform itself and reconstitute itself into new actors in the system. So it wasn't recognized in its old form, but there were no barriers to their inclusion in the new system. They could form new parties, they could be part of the new incoming party. And so the military's neutrality secured the stability of the new regime. It allowed those members to become civilian actors, to contribute to new political party formation, and again, to bind their hands to commit to the new system and their part in it. So the fluidity of the coalitions was absolutely how this played out in the kind of institutionalized sense, a kind of institutionalized fluidity of the party system, of legislative coalitions, and of the military's ability to participate in political parties and support democracy in this limited form. So there are a number of alternative explanations that we could look at for understanding how democracy was maintained and sustained in Benin and South Africa over these decades. And one would say that the international powers were particularly important for supporting democracy in both South Africa and in Benin. And that is absolutely the case in helping to catalyze transitions, right? That neoliberal economic and political forms were kind of forced upon Benin in this moment of crisis. The international sanctions for South Africa were important players. But that alone cannot explain how long democracy maintained in South Africa, that it's still going, and that democracy was maintained in Benin until 2019, because we can think about it as a catalyzing moment that helped to shape the nature of these institutions and power sharing arrangements, but it can't explain democratic endurance, because we've seen so many cases of competitive authoritarianism, right? We transition to multi-party elections, but we don't transition all the way to actual democratic substance, right? And so international support for these neoliberal reforms, political reforms, gets us only to competitive authoritarianism in many cases, whereas Benin and South Africa went much further. And then to speak to the debates that this volume holds up, there's a major question of normative commitment. And in Benin and South Africa, yes, there are strategic bargains among non-democrats that are key in these particular moments that allow for non-democrats to stay committed to democratic survival. So Benin is a particularly interesting case because we have, at successive periods across Africa, but particularly in Benin, we have presidents attempting third terms, right? And will they retire when they're voted out? We have this question across many places in the world. And so will non-democrats kind of learn to lose? And in Benin, they did in many cases. We see them transform. Karakou attempted, the president who was the former president during the authoritarian period, who was then reelected and came to power, he tested the waters about whether or not he could run for a third term. But democracy was sustained not because he was necessarily as an incumbent, not because he was necessarily committed to it, because the institutional constraints and the elite power sharing model among other actors in the legislature and among other parties made it difficult to opt out of those term limits. They made it difficult for one single elite to continue to concentrate power to such an extent. So in that sense, because political and economic elite resources were diffuse enough, they put pressure on the incumbent president to give up and to allow alternation. And so in that case, the elite power sharing was actually quite consequential for Benin to be able to maintain. But as Scott has alluded to, Benin has fallen under this kind of illiberal President Talon since 2019, and a what we might call a kind of democracide or democratic erosion, a very steep democratic erosion, in fact, one of the deepest declines in the world. And so this is also a kind of surprising or a major change from Benin's overarching democratic success. So what exactly has changed since 2019? I would argue that Benin has also always been really weakly institutionalized. The party systems, the way in which the fluidity was an essential component of this power sharing model, the kind of promiscuous power sharing model. And so the strategic calculations of inclusion had to continue in order to be useful and to be upheld through the various institutions, through the Constitutional Court, through civil society, through local governance incentives, and through bandwagoning among political elites at the national level. President Talon's election has shifted that calculation into extreme executive concentration of power because of his economic stranglehold of the country. So both in terms of his control over, he's called the king of cotton, he controls the cotton trade, he controls the port where the majority of import and export taxes are taken. And so that concentration of resources, the economic power that he controls, has allowed him to no longer need this kind of promiscuous power sharing. He doesn't need the inclusive bargain, and opposition has therefore weakened over time. The constraints of the power sharing model have weakened. And so in that sense, structural conditions that allowed these interests to power share for so long have changed quite dramatically with Talon's continuing ascension and concentration of power. In South Africa, certainly concerns over corruption weaken the quality of democratic governance and also the concentration of resource in terms of this collusion between political and economic class. But there remains a high civic engagement, an active press, a critique of corruption. And so in that way, I'm hopeful for democratic endurance and sustainability in South Africa. So I want to thank our leaders in this intellectual project and continue this conversation because it is absolutely so critical to thinking about the global decline of democracy in the United States and elsewhere, about how we can incentivize perhaps non-democrats, anti-institutionalists, populist leaders, extremists in whatever flavor you might see them, into binding their hands and exhibiting the kind of forbearance and mutual toleration that democracy requires. Thank you very much.
Scott, you guys like to join me? Yeah. At the table. Thank you so much, Rachel. We're really sorry you can't be with us in person. We are in large double dimension. So I just want to say a couple words before we open things up, just kind of by way of conclusion. I won't go into detail about my Indonesia chapter, but I did want to just make a few responses to this really great discussion in this wonderful volume. I think one thing I would stress is that this volume is really rare in the sense that it's multivocal yet not incoherent. And so everyone really tells a different story in each chapter. Each of these cases is quite a different narrative. They call attention to different kinds of actors. To Rachel's point, the debate is in no way, to the extent there's a debate over agency and structure or norms and interests, it's not settled here. There's lots of examples, I think, of each being important. And so it's really a great example of a book that has something to say in its introduction and conclusion, but doesn't force that same exact perspective and voice on all the others. So I really encourage people to read all the chapters in this volume. You got a sense from Rachel the kind of depth that people are going into. Really rich stuff. So say, like, how do we think about all of this? And I was, when I was thinking about this volume and listening to Scott and Tarek, I was reminded of one of my favorite essays about democracy, which was by Charles Tilly, who once wrote an essay called "Democracy is a Lake." And what he meant by that was that, lakes get created in all kinds of ways. So they can come about because of glacial melt, or they can come about because of some kind of river that gets cut off, or there's all kinds of ways that lakes come about. But once it's a lake, it's a lake. And it's got more or less the same features to it, regardless of how it came about. And I think and so this, I think, is a nice way of thinking about the idea that democracy is not going to always come about the same way, it comes about different ways. And so if that's true, then I think we should think of democracy in hard places as like oases. And that basically what we're looking for here is, so you have some bit of water, that somehow has managed to survive, desertification, the very hostile conditions, and yet you're able to find some water in this place. And if that's the case, then what we should all be doing is thinking for, like, everything should be up for grabs. Everything should be something we're looking for. Anything that could bring about one of these oases. You don't care if you're out without water in the desert, it's an oasis. And if it came about because of legacies of organized violent mobilization, like in Timor-Leste, or if it came about because of different notions of nationalism that came about through revolution in Indonesia, or if it came about because of particular values from the anti-colonial struggle in India, take what you can get, right? And the idea is not to sort of exclude or debates are fun, but the idea is not so much to say, let's favor these factors over these, but to say anywhere there's anything structural, anything in the realm of interest, anything in the realm of values, anything in the realm of norms that points you toward that little bit of water surviving in these hostile conditions, those would be things we should be looking for. And that's what's really great about all the chapters. They give us a lot of different material, a lot of different historical resources from which democracy can survive in a hard place. So that's sort of my reaction coming out of this. But everyone's been really great and patient listening to all this really good material. So does anyone have any questions for our panel to start with? Either here or online. People online can put questions in Q&A too. Jindai.
Thank you so much for the book and coming to talk to us. I know it has been said, it's not the emphasis of the book to talk about where these democratic commitments came from, but I just can't help it and would really appreciate if you could share some of your thoughts and wildest speculations, the unthinkable things that we could work on. Why at critical moments? I know one possibility mentioned was repudiation of historical wrongs, but at least sitting here, two opposite strains of thinking can be as appealing to elites. One is correcting the historical wrongs. One is doubling down even getting some sense of honor out of it and glorified doubling down. And what would make elite tilt that balance of scale while making critical historical decisions? And what is the role of non-elites in this process? Thank you.
I should let you go. Scott, I'll speak briefly, but Scott really, I think, has a lot more to say about this. If you look at the case that Scott writes about in his chapter, which is the case of Argentina, it's very clear that they were defining themselves in opposition to a very grim authoritarian period. So I don't know how you could define yourself in opposition to a period where human rights are systematically violated without defining yourself as somebody who wants human rights. And so I think in a lot of these cases, the India case is one where I could absolutely imagine what you're talking about. We were dominated by the white man. That does not necessarily mean that I should embrace democracy. On the contrary, if insofar as democracy is something that person brought, I could repudiate it. So India is a little bit of a harder case. But one thing I do think about with these normative commitments entailing is democracy becoming part of the identity in some way. And there are clearly some processes that might make democracy more part of your identity if your rival, be that a rival from the past, as in the case of Argentina, or a foreign rival, as it might be in the case of Ukraine. So the great article in the Journal of Democracy, the current issue of the Journal of Democracy by Olga Una, which is talking about how Ukrainians are now really embracing democracy in a way that you would not expect, given that they are in a rough neighborhood, they are being invaded, and they've been under threat of invasion from Russia for quite some time. These are kind of the raw materials that cause people to yearn for strong men, to acquiesce to authoritarianism. And yet, over the past several years, we've seen in Ukraine a real increase in support for democracy. That, to me, speaks to Ukrainians defining themselves in their identity in opposition to their invader. And you see this in some work by Stephen Fish on Mongolians and why are Mongolians so democratic? In part, it's because they're defining themselves in opposition to China. So I do think there are these processes that can lead leaders and citizens to define themselves and to define the nation as democratic, and that's often in opposition to a rival or to an other that is explicitly non-democratic. So that's the direction I might go.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you. I completely agree with the premise of your question. That is, every legacy can be contested. The interpretation of every legacy is politically mobilized and socially constructed. Absolutely. This might not be a great way to answer your question, but the Argentine case, for example, was an extreme one, right? You had a dictatorship that was defeated in an external war. It's really hard to reconstruct a pro-authoritarian legacy from such a dictatorship. India, I know incomparably less about India than the great author in our book, Ashutosh Varshney, but it's evident that there were different interpretations about how to combat the legacy of British colonialism. But for whatever reasons, maybe because the Indian National Congress from an early time, right? The dominant group, the Gandhi and Nehru group, they were absolutely committed to the idea that the successor to British colonialism had to be completely inclusive of all castes, religions, nationalities, linguistic groups. So is a different sequel regime imaginable? Yes, But under a dominant strain in the Congress party with Democrats, hardcore Democrats, right? I can't tell you why that group won out over alternative groups, but it clearly did. And that set the course for the subsequent 17 years, at least, of democracy in India. And I think it made it harder to turn against the idea that democracy in India should be for everyone. Obviously, the BJP has turned against that idea. The second part of your question about what is the role of citizens, of voters? Well, I think I paid far too little attention to this question until age 66. I'm 68 now, so but I mean, obviously, probably everyone in this room knows that the dominant route to democratic breakdowns in today's world is executive takeovers. Executive takeovers depend initially on the possibility that voters will choose leaders, almost all of whom have shown very illiberal signs even at their first election. So how do you inoculate voters so that only a minority will choose that path? I don't know very much about that. It's something that I'm working on a little bit now. Again, I mean, my evidence from the Argentine case is that I think it's very difficult to sustain democratic commitments over time. They don't sustain automatically. They have to be constantly renourished. And in Argentina, I think it was enormously helpful for 2 generations that the last dictatorship was such an abysmal failure. So, you know, Dan was part of this project on authoritarian successor parties, right? Some dictatorships are such dismal failures that they do not generate authoritarian successor parties. They cannot construct, there's no actor, powerful actor that constructs a memory that, oh, authoritarianism in some respects was good. In Brazil, right, we just saw the defeat of the authoritarian right-wing extremist, but he was made possible in part because the last dictatorship was economically very successful. And there was a powerful authoritarian successor party. So that dictatorship generated an aftermath of many voters who thought, yeah, that dictatorship, it was better than the democracy. Its economic performance was far better. So, I mean, that's not a coherent, complete answer, but those are a few thoughts about the great question. I think that the main answer is that question is something that we need to study much more. There's a lot of people are working on what erodes democratic commitments in voters. The main answer is polarization, but I'm not aware of people who are working on the flip side of that. What sustains democratic commitments among voters?
That's great. I'll say a couple words and then Rachel, why don't you go first, and then I'll say just a couple words. Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, I just want to jump in on that as well, because I absolutely agree, you know, kind of the failure of the prior government, the you know, as Scott has just laid out, the kind of the extent to which people are reacting against that failure of the prior system can generate amongst the broader society and elites a commitment to democracy as an alternative solution, right? That absolutely that's the case in South Africa, right? That democracy was seen as, and the creation of the Constitution was an incredible nationwide, countrywide dialogue around how we can create a different set of formal rules and national consciousness, right? That the Rainbow Nation was not just an idea, but one that had to be codified in the new set of rules and laws that would guide society forward so as to not relive this terrible apartheid past that everyone had now come to see as untenable. So absolutely, I think that the kind of depth of the past wrongs can help sustain democracy, commitment to democracy as an alternative solution that guarantees order, right? That guarantees economic stability, where the kind of the Benin example was this kind of economic chaos that's generated by this political uncertainty as well. So I think that does have, the question is, what is the half-life of those commitments, right? How long can that democratic buy-in be sustained as new types of crises may unfold? And that's the case in Benin in terms of, how long can people support democracy versus the kind of autocratic example of this, President Talon is the equivalent to Trump. He's the executive centralizer of power, the one for whom rules don't apply, and I can make my own solutions to take the country forward. And so the other question is really about what is the role of citizens and voters? And I would say here that the kind of role of citizens in supporting, in mobilizing as civil society in Benin was absolutely essential in those prior moments of potential, prior executive takeover, the willingness to give up power after 2 terms, example that I was mentioning. And so civil society mobilizing around democracy, I think is an incredibly important question. And so it's, how do the institutions interact with civil society support for democracy that allows for a kind of, in a Sherry Berman way, right? What is the content of social mobilization? And how does that interact with the strength of institutions that can help keep otherwise autocratic actors constrained? Dan?
Yes, I'll be brief, but I mean, there's clearly an ongoing politics that always has taken place of memory and legacy. And, we'll go what just happened in the Philippines, where there was kind of a very long-standing, effort to kind of rehabilitate the Marcos dynasty, and that's culminated in, we have another Marcos in the palace, and that's been devastating for democratic actors in the Philippines, and they're pushing back, and so that'll be a fight to watch. In terms of where these commitments come from, India and Indonesia have real parallels here, and really the roots of these nationalist revolutions and the ways in which that forged a kind of inclusive and egalitarian notion of what the nation was. These are not places, and you just compare to places like Pakistan, Malaysia, Singapore, where just the nation is defined in a very different way, where the heroes of the nation are these elites, and the idea that the people are kind of the saviors and the real sovereigns just doesn't exist in quite the same way. And I think that's stickier, right? I think this idea of just and that's a more structural phenomenon, whether or not at some point in history, the masses, the people, the youth in Indonesia kind of became the agents of national salvation. Like that's a hard thing to wipe out. And so I would kind of look to those kinds of things, and in places where there hasn't been democratic transition, but if you had some kind of revolutionary politics that has overcome, just an elite definition of the nation, I think that does give you raw material. So I think places like China and Vietnam, that exists, and that's important raw material to think about. Adam.
Yeah, so thanks, it's great. I really like this project a lot. I also just want to make a pitch for my favorite democracy in a hard place, Costa Rica after 48. Dan knows I love this case, but it's an amazing case of kind of every one of our theories of authoritarianism would suggest that, Figueres is not going to consolidate democracy, and he does. So anyway, I'm wondering if you guys would, maybe this is a volume 2 kind of question, but think a little bit about situating this volume in the post-Cold War period. And so I think as somebody mentioned afterwards, that the most common way that democracies break down now is by sort of incumbents subverting it from within. The military coup has declined substantially since 1991. However, in the last 2 years there have been 7 coup attempts, right? So I think the question is, how do we think about the role that the military plays here? We think there's a lot of really great attention played on kind of how do we inculcate a set of values among ruling parties and opposition parties, but what are the kind of values that we inculcate among military officers? Are we actually successful at doing that? Is there anything that's really changed after 91 other than American unipolarity? And with that ending, is how much of that is going to be a sort of a live concern over the 5 years?
Question about militaries is a really great one. One of the cases that when we first started working on this book that I thought would make it in, then it was Tunisia. And that's because as we were getting close to this, it was just clear that that place was going south. And in Tunisia sustained a democratic experiment for a little under 10 years. And a lot of the arguments about why it was able to do so hinged on the military and the characteristics of the military. Some people made the argument that it was because the military was very small. My view is if you look at, military coups throughout, the world and in Africa in particular, sometimes it's 7 guys and a dog and they're able to pull off a military coup. And so the Tunisian military is large enough to pull off a coup if it had wanted to. And there was a period where the people were really calling on the military to step in. But the argument that some scholars have made is that this is a military in which the principle of military subordination to civilian authority was very deeply entrenched. It was entrenched by the ruling party over a number of years, but also entrenched by the fact that this military is very deeply enmeshed in networks with the West. And so military officers from Tunisia are going to the West and getting training and imbibing this idea that a kind of modern, well-dressed military does not try to intervene in politics. That argument doesn't work for Egypt, which is a military that's similarly enmeshed in these kinds of networks. But there's clearly an argument there about the norm of subordination to civilian authority that I think could be explored a little bit more. And that does also, this is kind of punting on this question, but it also brings me to another alternative hypothesis about where the normative commitment to democracy comes from more broadly for partisan actors, militaries, et cetera. And that is from traffic with the West. Like that is an argument that needs to be put into our horse race here. There's a great article in the American Political Science Review by Sharon Verwal, where he was looking at the Tunisian case and trying to explain why some parliamentarians, Islamist parliamentarians, you expect to be quite retrograde when it comes to things like individual rights. Some of them were actually quite liberal when it came to voting on these things, whereas others were quite traditional and illiberal. And the argument that he made is that you can actually explain this with reference to the amount of traffic that they had with the West. And so the ones who, for random reasons, ended up spending most of their exile in France, they come back with pretty liberal ideas. And it could be that similarly, when we look at the case of India, and you look at that founding generation, a lot of those people, as Ashuvarshi points out, had a lot of traffic. So that is at least a mechanism that we should consider when we're thinking about where these normative commitments come from.
Yeah, on militaries, I think the agenda of the normal agenda in democratic politics is how do you keep the military under civilian control. And I think that's a really important agenda, but it should go beyond that, right? It should also include how do we nurture a democratic military. And I would add, how do we nurture a democratic police? Since the main contact point of citizens in daily life with public security is through the police. Tarek's colleague, Helen Gonzalez, is doing great work on this topic. I do worry that, right, what was it that prevented military coups? I think it was the possibility that the West would impose some kind of sanctions. Military coups are visible in a way that there's a certain flashpoint, right? That does not happen with executive takeovers. I worry that the relative decline of the EU and the United States compared to other places in the world, China and maybe add Russia, right? I think that the disincentives for coups are lessening. And I also think that, it's speculation, but I guess that the US will probably, and maybe, will be in a position of having to be more forgiving toward friendly dictators. So I think that for that reason too, the disincentives for coups are probably likely to diminish. Just a couple thoughts on the question. Oh, parenthetically, I completely agree about Costa Rica. We asked Deborah Yashar to write about Costa Rica, and she would have written a great chapter, but she had other things going on.
She wrote a great book.
Yep.
Rachel.
Thanks. I just want to concur with my colleagues in terms of thinking about this kind of the changes of the military and absolutely, as Scott has said, the disincentives for coups are lessened, particularly over the last decade. And I want to point to Mali as a key case here, in which Mali was the democratic darling of the 1990s, right? The kind of post economic and political neoliberal reform, the anti-modernization case, like one of the poorest countries in the world, and yet democracy was flourishing, elections were happening, there was turnover. And yet with the end of the Cold War and the rise of kind of non-state insurgent actors, security became a major concern for citizens. So in Mali, elections were functioning well. The first successful coup was on the eve of democratic elections, where the incumbent was widely predicted to lose, an alternation was going to happen, and a new opposition was going to come in. So there was, a kind of electoral democratic procedure to change policy. And yet the military took over because they argued that the state was incapable of broadcasting power to the periphery, right? The regime at the center, whether it was democratic or authoritarian, didn't meet the citizens' needs because it wasn't present, right? And the military was saying that the democratic regime at the center, whether it was party A or party B, wasn't going to change that. And so they needed to take power. And you heard barely a whimper from citizens who were poised to vote in a few days when this military coup took place. And so the kind of series of coups that we've seen since have reinforced the sense that, again, my second reference to Huntington in the day, but without a basic degree of order, it's hard to guarantee liberty that undergirds democracy as a value, right? So the kind of democratic values that we're talking about here, how we can ensure that citizens have that set of democratic values, requires their belief in the state's ability to provide the set of civil liberties and political rights that allow it to be expressed in a way that's meaningful to them. And without that, they make a very different set of calculations, and so does the military in terms of what their role is. And so I think this relates to a number of cases that have been unsettled by the post-Cold War order. And particularly in Africa, we see kind of with the fall of Libya, and the rise of extremists across the continent.
Well, all four of us work on regions where the military has historically played a really big role. I think all of us are similarly concerned. And I think I'd bring it back to Scott's main point here about just the danger of illiberal actors. So it's bad to have an illiberal civilian chief executive. But if you got a military that decides, that it doesn't see much benefit in democracy, things can end really badly and really quickly. And I think in my neck of the woods, look at Thailand and look at Myanmar, you can tell these structural stories like, well, it's about political order. These are just actors who have decided they could do it, And the idea, particularly in a place like Myanmar, the idea that this is facilitating political order is a complete nonsense. And so I think we really need to be expanding, Scott's notions here about like looking for the illiberal actors and saying, really anywhere where the military's got the autonomy to act, it's a danger everywhere. And so these questions of political militarization, these enduring questions, I think have to be kind of on the table as well. But this opens up a lot for people to think about, because there's a lot in here that I think people can think about in future research, and it really is a whole agenda which will go on. But we are so glad you guys were able to come and introduce this to us. Thanks everyone for coming out. I really want to thank Tarek Masoud, Scott Mainwaring, Rachel Beatty Riedl. Sorry you couldn't be here in person. Biggest thanks as always to Derek Groom for putting on such an incredible show. I compared him to Martin Scorsese earlier, but understating his filming and his directorial skills. But again, thanks again, and please join me in thanking this tremendous panel.